Good morning, everybody. This is Matthew James from Energy Post, and welcome to this panel discussion on unlocking the potential of bioenergy. I'm just waiting for our technical support to join with the slides, but whilst as if by magic, he's just online now. Thank you. Those of you who've joined us before, you know the routine. In a moment, I will introduce you to our panelists to get the discussion underway. But before we do so, I would like to just remind everybody the way that our Q&A system works. You've got a number of options of communicating with other attendees and with the panelists. It's the Q&A tab that you need to find. I know everybody's interface is slightly different, so find the Q&A tab on your interface on your computer and put your questions in there to our speakers today. That way, the other attendees can vote on the questions, and naturally, the questions that people want to see answered will float to the top. It makes my job as a moderator today a lot easier. So yeah, that's a reminder, use the Q&A tab. And when we come to the Q&A section, I will invite the questions that we go to, I will invite you to ask your question live. So be ready for that. We will switch your microphone on so you can ask your question in person to our panelists today. I'm just waiting for our tech support to begin the slideshow, and then I will introduce our first speaker. Today we have the topic of bioenergy, as you're going to see from our speakers, is already very important. 60% of renewable energy in Europe already comes from bioenergy. 50%, I think, is the global picture. You can see in the program today, we're going to begin with Dr. Riccardo Guerini. He will talk to you about that global picture and an extract from his IRENA's upcoming World Energy Transition Outlook. Today's event is sponsored by Enviva. Enviva are represented by Thomas Meth, and Thomas will be talking about the ability of his and other operations to scale and meet the demand that will be described by Dr. Guerini. We will then be coming on to two of the industries which are so important in terms of decarbonization, because they're so difficult to decarbonize and represent between them perhaps 5% of all our greenhouse gas emissions. So first of all, we have Winston Beck from Heidelberg Cement. He will talk about the role of biomass in decarbonizing the cement sector. And then later, Laurent Dansel from Airlines for Europe will talk about the same situation within biofuels for aviation, or SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuels. Laurent will join us slightly late. And of course, those of you who've signed up hoping to hear from Emmanuel Tilusport from ArcelorMittal will note that he wasn't able to attend. This was unavoidable. He sent his apologies, but due to situation in Ukraine and repercussions for their operations, he's had to drop out. And I'm absolutely delighted that we've been able to, Laurent has been able to join in his place today to bring us perspective from another of such the key areas. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Riccardo Guerini, or Dr. Riccardo Guerini. Dr. Riccardo Guerini is an economist. He joined IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, in 2018 as Senior Program Officer. He's co-author of the IRENA Global Roadmap Series, including the latest World Energy Transitions Outlook to 2050, which is due out later this month. And I hand over to you now, Dr. Riccardo Guerini. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew, for the opportunity, for Energy Post, for having me here. And indeed, this is a very critical and very, very important topic. So I think it's very timely to have this discussion here today. As we all know that, of course, renewable energy is key to deliver the energy transformation that we all need towards the 1.5C Paris Agreement compatible. What I will discuss today with you is the World Energy Transition Outlook. So in IRENA, we have this flagship report where we bring the global perspective for renewables, energy transition topics in general, but of course, having renewables as the center, the backbone of the transformation. And here today, we will see the bioenergy aspects that are key in that transformation. So the next slide. the key message, as you can see, is without biomass, we cannot achieve 1.5C compatible scenario. That's very, very important to say. We need to scale bioenergy. As you can see today, 50% of renewable energy is coming from bio. So we need to scale that amount up to 150 exajoules from 50, around 50 today. So that's tripling in 3 decades. So it's a massive amount of effort that is needed. Hope we can discuss that further today. And basically, as you can see in the right graph, it's a mix of course, solid biomass and biofuels and gases. So it's all about different sources that we're talking about. So this is comprised all and everything related to biomass in this information, as you can see here. So next slide, I would like to bring to your attention that there is a critical aspect that we must have in mind when we talk about this scale amount needed, so threefold. That is, of course, sustainable biomass. So sustainability is a very important topic, as we don't want to increase the biomass without proper measures, without proper actions in terms of the impact that could cause on ecosystems, society, etc. So as we all know, there are a lot of aspects under this sustainability criteria, and that's very important. But there is a lot of potential there, sustainable potential. There is uncertainty on that. In our scenario, the 150 exajoules by 2050 is in kind of middle of on the mean of this range. So we understand this is feasible and doable, of course, with the proper investment and with the proper criteria. So next slide. And as you can see, we're not alone there, right? So there are a lot of studies that also bring that amount of potential together. So it's important to say that it's not just the supply side that needs to transform itself in a way, scale and important investment needs, etc., but also the end use and all the end use. And here you can see we're talking about industry, so we'll have a discussion today that's very interesting. In the case of cement, we have transport. A lot of transport can count on biomass, and of course buildings, as we all know, the heating aspect there. And we are talking about here also the modern bioenergy, modern biomass. We're not proposing to scale up traditional biomass, of course. Biofuels in general for aviation and shipping, the hard to decarbonize sectors are key. I would like to also stress that, and also the chemical, so feedstock. That's also a very important topic that I would like to bring to your attention. So we're talking about green carbon, biocarbon. So next one, please. So a little bit on the specific industry consumption, use of bioenergy in industry. As we can see here, this is the factor that we need to scale up to 2050. As you can see, it's around 40 exajoules that we need by 2050. That's a lot of effort that's needed. This includes energy and feedstock. I will leave cement for later, but of course it's an important market there for the bio, and of course chemicals and the other iron, steel, aluminium. That's also an important contribution from bioenergy. So the message here is there is plenty on industry to be done in terms of adjustment, in terms of feasibility of production, consumption of bioenergy. So please, next slide. A little bit on transport, as we also have this discussion today. We do believe that the transport sector would count a lot with this aviation. So the transformation on the aviation side, sustainable biofuels, this is happening. So there's a lot of discussion there, as we can see, progressing. So 140 millions already, even more, I would expect. But of course, we need that a lot of scalability and also a lot of changes in terms of structure. Our scenario also brings the hydrogen and also other solutions on aviation that will also be able by 2050, but I think bio is one critical aspect. On shipping side, we understand as well that biodiesel related is important to bring here, biomethanol, of course, also hydrogen, ammonia related. So shipping is also an important market. As you can see there, aviation and shipping will bring additional consumption of bioenergy in the coming years and decades. The usual road transport, as we all know, of course, electrification in transport is a key drive in our scenario. We're talking about light vehicles, but also road cargo transport. But we do understand that for long-haul road transport, bio has an important role to play here, including biomethane. So this is a transformation that we envisage for these sectors. Next slide, please. So I would like to bring then to your attention how all of these will happen, right? So there are barriers, as we understand, and this is what, as you can see in the screen, sustainability we have already addressed, but there are a lot of policies that are still needed. We're talking about global policies, but of course, that's also the case of Europe. That's an important discussion to be had, how we can push further the use and the adjustment that is needed in terms of policies. And as you can see also, we need clear investment in terms of supply, in terms of upfront costs that are, of course, critical for this market. So of course, I'm not going to explore all of these. I think we will have opportunity to the sections to discuss that, but I think that's an important and critical aspect. If we really want to scale up all of these, we must go and try to understand how we can overcome all these barriers. So thank you, Matthew, and back to you.
Thanks very much, Ricardo. There are already some questions on some of the statistics, which we will come to very shortly. Thanks very much. Keep coming in with your questions, please, readers and viewers. I would like now to introduce Thomas Smith. Thomas Smith is co-founder and chief commercial officer at Enviva. Enviva is the world's largest producer of wood pellets that provide power and utility power and utility companies around the globe with low carbon drop-in alternatives to fossil fuels. Thomas, I'd like to hand over to you. This stage has been well set. Obviously, as far as IRENA is concerned, the demand is certainly there or the need is there. And I think you're going to address the scalability of production of biomass for us. I hand over to you now, Thomas Smith from Enviva.
Thank you, Matthew. And Ricardo, thank you for setting the stage as nicely as you did. My name is Thomas Smith. I'm talking to you here from Washington, D.C. That's where our headquarters is. And as you can see on the slide, we're a producer of sustainable biomass in the form of wood pellets here in the southeast of the United States. Our capacity is over 6 million tons today. And how do we get here in terms of producing product in the United States? Because most of it actually gets exported to Asia and Europe. When I started in the bioenergy or biomass space 20 years ago, when you wanted to be in biomass, you had to figure out where do you find the biomass and then find usage for the biomass right next to the source of biomass, which, given that most biomass has a moisture content of 50%, is very limiting because it's very difficult to transport over long distances. And where we use biomass is often far away from where we find biomass in a sustainable form. The reason why the US, as an example, but there are others like Canada, the Baltics, the Iberian Peninsula, Australia, New Zealand. The reason why we found some of those wood baskets is in the United States, for example, that the paper industry dramatically declined, and the type of wood that we use was quite literally left behind in the forest. And we started in the power and heat sector. Utilities in 2009 and 2010 approached us and said, we need reliable biomass in much larger quantities on a ratable basis, not just in the summer, not just in the winter, all year long like a commodity. And with that, we found the form factor of a wood pellet is the most cost effective to actually turn the heterogeneous biomass that you find in the forest into something that's homogeneous, transportable over long distances in a cost effective and carbon effective way. What we're seeing now, though, is that in addition to the power and heat sector, the industrial applications that Matthew alluded to, and then of course also Ricardo, is this next frontier of opportunity to scale biomass, whether it's the hard to abate industries like cement, like lime, like steel, sugar, asphalt. I mean, there's a long list of industries, but also the transportation sector, particularly around long distance ocean transportation and sustainable aviation fuels, where we need to mobilize larger quantities and generally bring them from where they're available to where they have the most need, where there are clusters of refineries that can turn the raw material into ultimately the final product. If you go to the next slide, please. I've been in this space for 20 years, and 10 years ago or 13 years ago, this industry started to develop where you created an industry that bridged that very question around availability of biomass to where it is most needed and can provide the most value. You can see that the largest user of wood pellets, industrial wood pellets, is Europe. And these numbers are slightly outdated, but the trend is just quite dramatic in terms of going in one direction. We're just using a lot more every year. And as you can see on the other side, the United States or North America is the largest exporter. We have very little demand. This is in the US, is driven by shale gas as the primary reason why we use less coal. And then you see Asia. It says excluding China. This is really important. When you look at this market, and in 2019, this is just the industrial market. We have a whole separate market for the domestic use in heating stoves. That's a slightly different product. There is some overlap, but it's not shown here. And China has another market of 20-30 million tons of wood pellets, we understand, but it's very much like from China, within China, for China. It's not part of this global trend. Matthew, if you go to the next presentation. As you can see from this slide, the capacity in the US to fill the void of the pulp and paper industry has been quite enormous, and has a lot of potential. From where the paper industry was 20 years ago, we can take US production to at least 3 times of what we're doing today. And you do see that trend in other parts of the world. Obviously, I would be remiss to not mention that the Russian volumes that virtually all of that goes to Europe today will not be available for the foreseeable future. If you go to the next slide, Matthew. One of the things that when we talk about scale is you have to start talking about the scale of the forest resource. The southeast of the United States is one of the largest wood baskets in the world. The forest land area in the southeast of the United States, just forests, is the total land size of Germany, Spain, and Italy combined. And so when you go from Washington to Houston, that wood basket, the land is between 50 and 60% covered by forests. Those are commercial forests. Many of those forests did not exist 100 years ago. As agriculture moved more to the Midwest, those forests were reforested or afforested by private landowners. 85 of the forest land is owned by private landowners to replace rather marginal agriculture. And they call themselves tree farmer in many instances. Last slide, and Ricardo talked about this. we cannot talk about biomass without talking about sustainability. Not all biomass is equal. Biomass has to fit in the within the definitions of sustainable biomass with the Renewable Energy Directive, of course, but also from a social license to operate. We function in the symbiosis with the traditional forest products industry. For example, we try to site our facilities not only where the paper mills have left, but where the sawmilling industry is strong. Think about it that way. If you harvest a tree, the first thing we have to maximize is carbon storage of that tree in furniture products or in building products. Typically 50% of a tree can be milled further into rather permanent carbon storage. The other 50% can be used for bioenergy, pulp and paper more historically. And so you see that we have to fit into that byproduct of the traditional forest products industry, of the byproduct of the as a harvesting residue. We cannot just disrupt the overall equilibrium of how forests are being used for all sorts of different carbon beneficial usage. Matthew, I'll leave it at that to frame the discussion. Looking forward to the discussion and very happy to answer any questions that the audience may have, and appreciate the invitation and the great work you're all doing at Energy Post.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Thomas, Chief Commercial Officer at Enviva, and Enviva is the sponsor of today's talk. So glad that they are supporting this discussion on bioenergy. As we said at the top of the program, the importance of bioenergy within our renewables consumption can't be overstated. And from what I've heard so far, we can only expect that to grow and grow rapidly, multiple times over the course to 2050. Next, I would like to introduce Winston Beck. Winston Beck is Head of Government Affairs at Heidelberg Cement. Heidelberg, world-famous company, one of the world's largest construction materials companies, and cement accounts for, I understand, around about 3% of greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 being importantly amongst those. Winston, what is Heidelberg's approach to decarbonisation? What do you see the opportunities? What's your approach? And perhaps if you could give us a snapshot now, and then we can return to see that in context of the other speakers' comments. Over to you, Winston.
Yes, thank you very much, Matthew, and everyone, and thanks very much for the invitation to this event. I don't have any fancy slides, unfortunately, so but I will give you a short introduction about who we are and our CO2 and sustainability, the roadmap going forward. So Heidelberg Cement is one of the world's largest manufacturers of building materials. Our core products include the production and distribution of cement and aggregates, which are actually the two main essential raw materials to produce concrete. Concrete, as you all know, is a highly demanded product, much needed for the construction of housing or central infrastructure, but it's actually also the basis for every windmill and hydropower dam, for example. So it's also very much part of the green transition. At the same time, it's clear that concrete and cement production comes with a large CO2 footprint. We are very much aware of our responsibility. And this is also the reason why we have set ourselves very ambitious climate targets. So we were actually the first cement company in the world which had a science-based climate target for 2030. And we also aim to offer all our customers carbon neutral concrete by 2050 at the very latest. And I can really say that the whole company is working very hard to achieve and implement these targets on a daily basis. But in order to achieve these targets, it's also clear that we need a variety of different technologies and solutions, right? I think it's good to understand that 60% of our emissions are unavoidable process emissions, which are coming from the calcination of our main raw material, which is limestone. And for that, we need solutions such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as well as moving into substituting the limestone, which is the most CO2 intensive part of our production process. But 1/3 of our emissions are combustion related. And here really the discussion around biomass and also, of course, alternative fuels can make a big difference for our company, but also for the climate reduction worldwide. And I think it's also, especially at the moment with all the developments we are seeing, the shift away and to end our dependence on fossil fuels is absolutely key, and it's also a core part of our CO2 roadmap. Besides, of course, improving our energy efficiency in each and every of our plant and switching to renewable electricity, we are intending to increase the use of alternative fuels as well as biomass. So in 2019, in our global production, we were at 25% alternative fuels, with I think a biomass percentage of around 9%. And we aim by 2030 to increase that to 43% alternative fuels with a biomass content of around 19%. For the moment, we only use waste-based biomass, for example, dried sewage sludge or waste wood. We also use waste products from other industries. Think, for example, about organic textiles or even the cores from the olive production. And we also have a local sourcing strategy, meaning that we focus on local solutions, at least wherever and whenever that is possible. Well, a change of our biomass sources, one thing which also Thomas alluded to, I think that must be assessed on specific local circumstances and where the availability of secondary materials are at risk. However, at the moment, at least we are usually restricted by the market forces, meaning price. And of course, it's absolutely key that any of the sources we are using is really accompanied by a detailed environmental and social impact assessment. In addition, maybe it's good to mention that we can already generate over 90% of the thermal energy in the kilns of our cement plants using these secondary fuels. And in addition, we can also use not just the thermal energy, but we can also use the residual ash that is not being burned as a substitution product for our primary raw material. And that process is called co-processing, and it's really a fantastic circular economy solution. Now, in terms of maybe quickly, I think we will come to the policy asks. We are very much, of course, monitoring the discussion around the Green Deal and are quite positive. We do believe that we need a strengthened CO2 price to make investments into these technologies even more attractive. At the same time, I think we also need to talk about an improved carbon leakage system, at least as long as we don't have a global CO2 price. When it comes to the use of these biomass sources I mentioned, as well as the alternative fuels, we do support a landfill ban for waste because these materials can be better co-processed, and we can actually also help to avoid harmful decomposition related emissions. And of course, as I mentioned, biomass certification is also key, but it also needs to be implementable. So it really needs to be possible for our plant managers and also for our suppliers to actually provide us with the data needed. And the last point is that we, of course, also look into when we use biogenic energy sources to capture these emissions and either store them or utilize them in products. That's so-called the BECCS technology. And if we apply BECCS, we, of course, could also be able to account for the negative emissions. So they need to be recognized either in the European ETS system, or, for example, there needs to be a carbon removal crediting scheme or sort of. I think that's it for now. You're on mute.
Thanks, Winston. Yeah, that's plenty. You've given us a lot to reflect upon then, and I'm just checking if Laurent has joined yet. He's still not with us. So I think what we'll do is, before Laurent comes in and gives us a perspective from the airlines industry, if we can already start the discussion amongst the speakers here. If we want to move the discussion on in terms of what actions need to be taken in order that bioenergy can fulfill its potential. If I were to come back to you at this point, Ricardo, you've just heard from Winston some asks on the policy front. He talks about strengthening the price of CO2. He talks about carbon leakage system, biocertification, landfill bans. I mean, this is a half a dozen areas that Winston sort of identified as critical. From your point of view, what would you say are the barriers / policy actions that need to be taken to ensure that the path is there for sustainable biomass and bioenergy products to reach their potential? Ricardo.
Thank you much. I think this is a very important indeed discussion. So I appreciate the other speakers' very interesting presentations, and I think this is a good example of how we should move forward. So I think this is very, very critical. And as I presented before in the last slide, we have a lot of barriers yet. If we want to scale up at that level that is required for the 1.5C, so we're talking about, again, the 150 exajoules, all types of bioenergy related, biomass, feedstock, etc. So, and I may start with exactly the carbon price. I think this is one very critical element to the table, because that will allow I would say, the relative pricing mechanisms to play an important role in that sense. And this is one of the aspects that we, as well, in our analysis indicate as key in terms of course, this regional and global effort to scale renewable energy. So carbon price is very, very important. Hope we can see in the coming months or years these mechanisms spreading and bringing more, I would say, price correction to the market. But that's one aspect. I think, of course, the certification is another barrier, as we know that this is related to the sustainability. So that's another important aspect that we do recommend as well in our global analysis, because of course the trade aspects that are behind that, and that was also something that Thomas brought to the discussion, is an important component. So certification and trade. So we are all agreeing on these sustainability aspects. But in general, I think that requires a coordination between the different stakeholders that are playing that field. So if we look at some experiences, for instance, in Latin America or even in ASEAN, so we would like to see more coordination in terms of how these NDCs and how the different ministers, they can bring together, let's say, the strategy to scale bioenergy, and bring in, of course, in that sense, the sustainability aspects, but as well the benefits related to CO2 mitigation. I think this is one important aspect. So how we will coordinate this bioenergy.
Ricardo,
yes.
It'd be interesting, I think, to get Thomas's reaction to some of the points you've made before you continue.
Okay.
Thomas, this issue of certification, how does that play into the development of your business?
Well, certifications are important because it gives industry, but also regulators, a checkpoint that is from independent third parties, right? So I think it's very important. I think when you look at regulators, they on the one hand they want to mobilize biomass, and at the same time they don't want unintended consequences, rightfully so. And I would say when it comes to the barriers and what we need to make sure we we create is investor certainty is the key word that I would present here. And in Europe, for example, Europe passed RED II in 2018. It's not implemented on a country level in most instances, but we're in the middle of RED III, which should be implemented by 2025. And so there's a lot of noise in the system, and that makes it difficult to invest. When you think about a carbon price, I think carbon prices have of course moved in a very favorable direction to mobilize biomass and to look at biomass. I would suggest that countries who want to create investable certainty for industry should consider at least a contract for differences for carbon, which means that there is a minimum carbon price that allows for the supply chain, whether it's the biomass producers or the users or anybody in between, to actually create certainty for a long period of time. We need 10, 15, 20-year certainty, which today regulators do not provide. And so I think that is the major barrier of really unlocking the potential of bioenergy.
Thanks, Thomas. I'd like to bring it back to you, maybe for Winston, for you to comment on some of these issues that you raised, particularly the CO2 price strengthening. It's strong enough at the moment, isn't it? I mean, could you be a bit more specific about what you would like to see in terms of stabilizing or continuing to strengthen this CO2 price?
Yeah, I think Thomas brought it quite well to the point that we need to have some certainty about how the price will develop going forward. Indeed, it has increased quite a bit over the course of the last year. It has dropped actually quite a bit over the course of the last week. I mean, generally we are in favor of having a market-based system, right? Which is the whole idea around the ETS and not having a political induced carbon price itself. And as we have seen the development of the ETS, it knows one way, which is up, which is also one thing we support. But of course, there could be some considerations about having certain bandwidth in which the price can develop, which is actually the market stability reserve. It hasn't perfectly functions in the past, we can say. But generally, I mean, the idea of having revising the ETS to have a strengthened price going forward is a good thing. And I also agree that in addition, we need to think about other measures such as financing and funding schemes, which can provide some additional certainty and also some de-risking, in particular for new innovative climate technology and projects. And one solution which was mentioned already, I think, which is very important and has worked very well in some jurisdictions already, is the idea of having a carbon contract for difference. And some of these funding schemes, we have seen that in the Netherlands and in some other countries. And I think that is something which could be developed very soon, which could help us to invest in these new projects. And it's also a very fair system, right? You have a strike price. You make sure that you don't get much, but you also don't get too little, and you reduce the risk.
Thanks, Winston. Ricardo, what are your comments on those suggestions, those ideas?
Indeed, I mean, as I said, those are part of this portfolio of key measures. Perhaps I would like also to bring the one additional idea, and maybe to hear from you what you think also, that is mandates and obligations. So if you think that's also an interesting way to move forward, so basically some sectorial mandates, or even in the case of, I would say, the scalability of transport, we can hear later as well, the new colleague. But basically, is that also something that we, in our survey, we identify as one possible way to go as well?
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I am just checking to see whether we've been joined by Laurent. He's still he is on his way, I've just heard. So what I would like to do is to maybe reflect on some of the questions that have come in from our audience. There are some questions. Just checking. Yeah, so we have a question in from Tiffany Chung. Tiffany Chung has a question for you, Thomas. Tiffany, are you able to? Oh, sorry, Ed. Are you able to connect Tiffany to the discussion? Tiffany, if you could open your audio when the invitation comes in.
I don't think I've been given co-host privileges to do that.
Okay. Thanks, Ed. 1 second. Tiffany, now you should have been given the microphone. And if you'd like to ask your question to Thomas Smith of Enviva, please go ahead. Thomas, I'm going to shortcut this. The question from Tiffany is as follows. Thomas, does Enviva have plans to move into biochar production, especially as decarbonization through offsetting is becoming an avenue of increasing interest to companies in hard-to-abate sectors? Winston, you may also have thoughts on this, but first to you, Thomas.
Well, it's a great question. When you think about and I'm sure the colleague from the aviation fuel industry can talk about this a little bit more. When you think about the different avenues to further refine biomass, right? If you step outside of the traditional energy, power and heat sector, whether you use gasification, pyrolysis, or other technologies, you end up with elements of biochar, a liquid, and a gas. And I think depending on the further usage, you can adjust the technology to maximize, one of the three or two of the three for the highest possible value. Where our role, typically, we've played our role as not the technology supplier who then turns biomass through pyrolysis or other technologies into further products, but I wouldn't rule it out. More broadly, I think all three form factors of further refinement from the traditional biomass to liquids to gas, as well as to biochar, see huge demand upticks. So I think as an industry, for sure, we will make further inroads into the biochar applications, because they are a fantastic way to decarbonize some of the sectors that we're talking about.
Thomas, thank you very much. Winston, do you have some comments there? So just to explain, Tiffany is working at offsetting a procurement company working in the EU UK ETS, and was looking for your thoughts on this too.
On biochar in particular, I cannot contribute much. I mean, we have looked into this. We have 2 research projects on this ongoing, I think, but it's not part of our overall roadmap for the time being. That can, of course, change in the future, but it's not part of our fuel mix so far.
Okay, Tiffany, hopefully you are happy with the question, with the answers that you received from us today. Next, most popular question is from Jeffrey Douglas. Ed, are you able to connect Jeffrey? Jeffrey has a question about the carbon balance cycles. And I believe Jeffrey is joining us now. Jeffrey, if you've asked your question, and if you could say...
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Jeffrey, if you could tell us your organization as well, that'd be great. Thank you.
Just personal interest, representing myself, I guess. So my question is about the sourcing. So it's after felling forests with biomass. This is in the context of another question, which is about the kind of process emissions of the biomass transportation processing, how long does it take before that felled and burned forested area return to carbon neutrality?
Thomas, this sounds like one for you.
Well, I see it in the chat, right? And so if you give me, if we give me a minute, I think we have to talk about this just broadly. And I start with the carbon benefits of biomass before transportation. So let's separate those two discussions for a second. The UN IPCC has had to make a choice about 20 years ago whether to count carbon from bioenergy usage in the forest or at the usage, and decided to count it in the forest. And the reason for that was that the usage is so fragmented. Think about cooking stoves all over the world or fireplaces all over the world, that you would never count all the usage, but you can count all the biomass coming out of the forest. So whether it's the US or any European country or countries in the world, we every year we count how much wood is taken out in our forests and how much is replenished. And so what does sustainable biomass look like? That it starts with, you have to start with those that carbon balance between what you take out and what you use for any usage has to be positive, or in other words, you have to grow more trees than you take out, as a sustainability question. The second point is, and I think that's a bit of a misconception of how biomass is scaled, that you start felling all sorts of trees wholesale for bioenergy. That's not what's happening in the forest. It is a byproduct of the traditional forest products industry. And with that, the counterfactual is not a tree that will be left standing. It's wood that really is not finding another usage in most every instance. I think it is important for sustainability purposes that wherever you take wood from, you have to make sure that this stays as a forest. To make sure that from a landscape perspective, we can continue to monitor and on a track level basis that more trees grow tomorrow than were taken out yesterday. On the transportation question specifically, the transport in a large ocean-going vessel from the US to Europe, for example, emits on a per ton basis as much carbon as a truck going between 200 and 300 kilometers on the road. So it's not carbon free, but it's not this, the intuition would tell you that the carbon must be so much more that we use for that. But because it is very large scale transport, it's actually compared to 200 or 300 kilometers on the road. All that being said, so if you just replace coal in a lime kiln, the carbon benefit may not be 100% because you have those transportation and the production of wood pellets, but it's 89%. Or if you replace coal in the power plant, the carbon benefit is between 80 and 85%. If you subtract all the emissions of production and transport. I will make one last point. I don't think that's in the long term that's good enough. Even our industry, we have to deal with the carbon emissions of production and transport, and that's why we committed that our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030 we will be net zero, to actually eliminate the question altogether. And we're making good progress against that. But even if you don't do it, the carbon benefits of bioenergy compared to fossil fuels are enormous.
And Thomas, those ships, are they running on biofuel?
Not yet, but they will. And that's the question I think that we're gonna see when it comes to long distance transportation. I will mention a company that has been very public about its leadership in that, which is Maersk. They have said publicly that they have ordered ships that will run on biomethanol from 2025 on, if I remember that correctly. And so those are really very promising signs that we see leadership in that industry. And biomethanol, as an example, is one of those verticals of the usage of bioenergy that I think are very promising.
Thanks, Thomas. And that answered one of the other questions that was coming to the top from Sasha. I have a question for Heidelberg. François Issard. I assume, well, François, is that correct pronunciation? François Issard, are you able to connect, François? This is a question for Winston, I believe.
Oui.
Yeah, welcome, and please ask you if you could explain who you are and ask.
Well, I'm a former employee of Total Energy, but I'm retired now. I'm consulting in the energy sector, transition of energy. I'm particularly interested by the view of IRENA in terms of the usage of wood for cooking. We talk about stove, cooking stove in Africa, because a major problem for the transition energy in Africa is going to be the fact that they use mostly in sub-Saharan Africa the woods and bushes that they collect around to cook their meals. So it's a major problem for Africa in terms of emissions and also an environmental footprint. Is there a solution which has been thought about at IRENA level in terms of either policies or both policies and technology? That's the first question. The second question is more for the cement industry. It's the issue of carbon capture, because I don't see in the future to reach the carbon neutrality goals that this industry can escape the problem of capture and storage, or utilization and storage. So we'd like to know from Heidelberg where they stand on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. Ricardo, could you very quickly comment on this issue of the wood-burning stoves that he's referred to?
Yes,
before?
yes.
Thank you. Just quickly.
Yeah, so we have both technologies that could play a role in bringing more efficient use of wood-related. So basically, efficient cook stoves, and I think this is one key aspect that we do recommend. But also there are other renewable energy solutions that could play a role as solar technologies, but also, of course, LPG as part of the broader aspect. So I think that's the technology side. And for policies, of course, investment and finance is the key aspect here. So basically, we understand here that there is a play in how to bring that to the consumers. So basically, governments and private sector could assist on that aspect.
Thank you. Winston, where does Heidelberg stand on CCUS? I'm not sure it's about whether it's a pro or against. I think that's you've covered that already. It's more about where you stand in terms of development, R&D stage, or already applications. That's it.
Yes. Well, as I mentioned, I mean, CCUS is a key technology for us, both for our process emissions, but also when we are using biogenic resources and to capture the emissions for the negative emissions, in order to make sure we're also covering the residual emissions more and more. We are moving to climate neutrality. In terms of technology progress, I mean, the technology actually is carbon capturing and also the storage has been used for many years by other industries, mainly the oil and gas industry. So we have learned a lot over the last years. We have several projects worldwide where we are trying to scale this technology. The one which is maybe the closest to operation is the one in Norway, where we installed the first industrial scale CCS project at a cement plant in the world. It will go live in 2024, capturing 400,000 tons of CO2 and storing them underground with the help of Northern Lights, the Norwegian project. But we also have another project, for example, in Slite in Sweden, where we are targeting 1.8 million tons of CO2 to be either utilized or stored by 2030, which would then be the first climate neutral cement plant in the world. And both of these projects mentioned have quite a high content of biomass in their fuel mix. So really, that would be a fantastic opportunity also to generate negative emissions via BECCS. So very much feasible, very much in the pipeline. But it's also very clear that we need to work on the political framework to make CCUS and BECCS happen in Europe, right? So I mentioned that we need to be able to acknowledge the emission savings and credit them. And the second is that we also need to have the infrastructure for the CO2. And that is something which we see could become a bottleneck in Europe. So that's really something where we need to start discussing the rollout and also how to do it cross-border.
Thank you, Winston. And another question from Fiona Matthews. Fiona is asking also, so you're getting a lot of the questions here, Winston, is asking about the feasibility of hitting your 90% biomass goal. Are you able to do that purely using local low-cost waste biomass, or do you envisage needing other biomass feedstocks in the future?
I mean, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, I think that depends a bit on the local situation. That will be a case by case thing we need to do. I mean, all the studies we have read shows that waste production will actually peak only in 2045. So there is a lot of these materials available, and it's clear that we need to use and work together to use the waste sources and use all the technologies that complement each other, both cold processing and waste to energy. So in addition to, we need landfill bans, and we also need to make sure that the processing is being done more efficiently and effective. So I think we can achieve these targets. It's 19%, not 90%. Hope that's not misunderstood. But it's also clear that we need to develop the right solutions together with our value chain and together with the stakeholders in these industries.
Thomas, is that something you can help with, or where?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I will not claim that I'm a cement expert. Winston is, but cement does have more flexibility in what kind of biomass they can use compared to many other industries. And so when you compare when you think about this, the lime industry or the steel industry, the requirements that they have on biomass are much narrower from a just a homogeneity perspective, and so that's why the local resources are more likely to just not be enough. And so you certainly have to find a balance between local and the global demand from just purely from a supply security perspective.
Thank you very much, Thomas. At this point, Energy Post readers, I'm really happy to say that we've been joined by Laurent Doncel. Laurent, I hope I'm pronouncing your surname correctly. You can straighten me out if not. Laurent is Laurent Doncel is Senior Policy Director at Airlines for Europe, A4E. A4E is the united voice of Europe's leading airlines in Brussels, representing 70% of air traffic, or staggering figure, 700 million passengers transported in 2019 alone. Welcome, Laurent. Thanks for joining us at such short notice.
Thanks, Matthew. Apologies for joining in the middle of the discussion, but very interesting to see the questions and the points that were raised, which are very similar to the challenges that we are facing also within the aviation industry.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and I know that we're going to hear from you about your approach to decarbonisation very shortly. But I'm also aware that, Ricardo, you are a little bit pressed for time. There were a couple of questions directed at you from our readers. One in particular that I wanted to ask you before we lost you. It's from Ivan Quayle. Ivan, are you able to join us live?
Yes.
Ivan, thank you very much for joining us. You've got a question for Ricardo about some of the stats in his presentation.
Yes, you gave a figure of 4.5 gigatons of CO2 removed. Is that counting the CH4 as 28 times worse than CO2 as far as global warming is concerned? In other words, global warming potential over 100 years, or is that counting it as 84 times worse global warming potential 20 years?
We get the idea. Ivan, can you just clarify that for us, Ricardo, quickly?
That's CO2, yes, that's CO2. So we're not counting, so it's CO2 related, indeed.
Indeed, I thought that was the answer. There was another question which came in about your presentation before you go, which was about demand, supply and demand. There was one reader's question that seemed to be a mismatch, which was about 150 exajoules demand, but production of only 90. Could you just comment on that, please?
No, perhaps this is related to what is final energy consumption and what is the primary energy supply. So we're talking about consumption at one side and the supply at the other side, including electricity generation, so the transformation related. So that's where you see the difference between 150 and the final energy consumption.
Thanks very much, Ricardo. If you have to go, obviously I wanted to say thanks very much for joining us and giving us such an excellent background, and you've put us in great shape to finish the session today. Ricardo Guarini from IRENA, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Great event. Bye.
Before we take any more questions from the audience, I would like to to bring back in Laurent. Laurent, perhaps you could give us the view of the airline industry in Europe with regard to unlocking potential of bioenergy.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, and very happy to be joining the discussion today. I have a couple of visuals that I want to share with you, if that's okay. If you are able to see my screen. Oh, there it is.
Just if you could take us just through the real highlights. Yes. We're looking at the clock at the moment.
Yeah, of course.
Keep it to about 5.
So if so what you have in front of you is the decarbonization roadmap for the aviation sector, which we agreed upon in just over a year ago, and you will see that it's far from being simple, considering that there is no single one that you can or single measure that you can trust or rely on in order to decarbonize. It's basically a mix of 4 different measures: improved technology, so current aircraft and future aircraft technologies, ATM, so air traffic management and operation, more direct routings, and reliance on economic measures, called the ETS, obviously, but CORSIA, which is the ETS equivalent at the UN level. Especially these economic measures are going to be the bulk of how we contribute to the EU Green Deal and the Fit for 55 targets between now and 2030. But however, between 2030 and 2050, and what you see, and if you can move to the next slide, the big part in how we can reach net zero by 2050 comes from sustainable aviation fuels, and that is roughly 34% of our contribution to the Green Deal. And because of the higher prices, also has an impact on demand in the sense that fuel price, sustainable aviation fuel prices being higher, more expensive than kerosene, are likely to mean more expensive flight tickets. So there's also, we expected an impact on demand, which would mean that there are less people flying, or that the growth altogether of the sector is lower. Now, if you just very quickly on the next slide, if that's possible, what's interesting with the sustainable aviation fuel is, and you can move on to the next, thanks, is that between now and 2050, the use of these drop-in fuels, so we're talking here about sustainable fuels that can be blended with kerosene, allows us to mitigate roughly 100 million tons of CO2 between now and 2050. And that's a massive deployment compared to where we are now, because sustainable aviation fuel, which is aviation biofuel in the aviation sector, represents less than 0.01%. So you can see a little bit how much we need to rely on the deployment of SAF. Most of them are already approved and they're already in the market, but it's the scale that we haven't reached yet. In the short term, these fuels will be bio-based, so we call it HEFA, and in the future, obviously, as for many other sectors, we will be talking and we'll be relying on synthetic fuels, power to liquid. And very much, this is very much happening as we speak, because there are a number of proposals under the Fit for 55 package of measures of the European Commission that notably put in place a SAF blending mandate at all European airports. Every airport you will buy SAF from between, as of 2025, will have a percentage of sustainable aviation fuels, starting at 2% in 2025, going up to 20% in 2035. That raises a lot of questions. How do we have enough feedstock? What is the risk of land use change? Is there a risk of distortion of competition, that some passengers or airlines would connect outside of the scope of the EU regulation compared to inside because of the higher cost? And also, where will the financing come from? And this is very much linked to the finance and the sustainable finance taxonomy. We expect very soon an update of the delegated act on the sustainable finance to include aviation activities and also sustainable aviation fuels. So really, these are the points that I wanted to mention with concerns and challenges, which, as I mentioned, are not dissimilar to other sectors and other modes of transport.
Oh, just unmute myself. Thank you very much, Laurent, for that real kind of whirlwind tour through your views on decarbonizing, or sustainable aviation fuels. And that may raise some new questions amongst our audience. But first of all, initial reaction, Thomas, having heard from Laurent there.
Well, Laurent, it's nice to meet you. We have seen quite a dramatic uptick in interest for biomass supply in the SAF space over the last 6 to 12 months. And it's fascinating to see how what development is actually happening. So it's real. There's urgency behind it. I think what's a little bit open is what the business models look like, and what the different roles of different players are. Because when you think about, you have a biomass carbon, it requires quite a few steps to get from biomass to putting something on an airplane, and as you have a lot of byproducts in that process that you can't use for SAF, whether it's biochar, as we talked about earlier, or biogas. And so the question of location of the intermediary steps are really important. Are you going to go into the forest, for example, or to the source, and then ship your product to the refineries from there? Or are you going to go much closer to the refineries? Because you have all the byproducts, and the business model looks much better if you have high value usage for all the products that come out of the process steps. And so we've seen both, but there is certainly a tendency to be closer to the refinery, which speaks to the transportability of biomass to those places where refining actually happens, rather than going into the forest. But again, we'll see probably both business models. The jury is out if there is a winner, or if just both, or even other ones will work to mobilize the sustainable aviation fuels that Laurent was talking about.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Thomas, because it also leads to other concerns that we have when it comes to the integrity of the single market. We know that biomass will not be available at all corners of Europe, yet we are a global business. And the distortion in the competition is very high if you have biomass more available, say in the north, for example, than in Cyprus. That indeed means that you're more likely to find the refineries and to be able to access the SAF in, I would say, north of Europe than in the south of Europe. So how do we also make sure that, because that the legislation, because we're really now going into, if I may, a planned economy approach, since we have soon a mandate to every single airports or fuel picked up at European airports, we need to have a percentage of SAF. How do we also make sure that this doesn't distort the market, and that you also, from a logistical perspective, can find the fuel at all corners of Europe? And there you have various options on the table. Do we work through mass averaging, mass balance system averaging, or the actual guarantee that you have the physical molecule of the sustainable fuel available at all airports, whether small or big, or whether regional airports or hub airports. That really is the challenge that we're facing. And when it comes to the sustainability, it's very important for us. We know that the aviation sector, at least for the long haul flight, so it's your transatlantic flight, for example, has no alternative to decarbonization than liquid fuels because of the thrust you need. We may see hydrogen and electric playing a role for the intra-European flights between now and 2035. So for short haul, it says flights between 3 and 4 hours, but there is no alternative to these liquid fuels for the long term. So we will be possibly at in the 2050 horizon, one of these few sectors, and the IEA says the same, one of these few sectors still relying on liquid fuels emitting CO2 because there is no alternative. By then, other sectors will be able to rely on different technologies, but for us, it's really these liquid fuels that are then increasingly sustainable that are the only options where we can meet our climate objectives.
Laurent, just to be clear, in terms of liquid fuels, in your scenario, you were talking about by 2050 to have perhaps as much as 34% in the mix. Is that right?
That is our forecast in terms of what we think we can access in order to meet our decarbonization commitment.
And is that can you just explain for our audience, is that a mixture of technical and cost barriers that we're up against there? Why can't it be higher? Why shouldn't the ambition be higher in terms of reaching net zero for the airline industry?
Well, there's a couple of challenges. Indeed, the technical is one. You know, are we going to be able to access the feedstock necessary to create these fuels? Will there be enough capacity also that for us to uptake these fuels without jeopardizing connectivity? For example, because these fuels are necessarily more expensive, that means that certain routes will become less affordable, or certain people will be priced out of the aviation market, and then you are quickly open to other consideration in the general debate about the decarbonization. Is how do we make sure that we decarbonize, but it doesn't come at the expense of social or regional issues? And that is really also where we need to have this balance of measures for a sector which has no other alternative than sustainable liquid fuels to be able to decarbonize.
And Matthew, I just want to hone in on one point that Laurent made, which is the regulatory certainty. I mean, when you think about a renewable energy directive and the equivalent in the US, and let's talk about a transatlantic flight from the US to Europe, right? And where do you actually produce the sustainable aviation fuels? Today, the US definition of what sustainable aviation fuel is under the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is different than what the Renewable Energy Directive 2 would say, right? Or for biomass in general. So, and then every country in Europe could theoretically actually take RED 2 and add different regulations. And so on the one hand, one could say, oh, this is great because there's an arbitrage there. But at the same time, if every country has a different definition of sustainability, it creates a complete mess. And that's particularly pronounced in sustainable aviation fuels and things like biomethanol, because the usage is not limited to a country, right? It's not stationary like an industrial application in a particular country.
Is that when you're talking about Europe, do you see that that there's variance within across the EU 28, or are you talking about sort of generally globally?
Well, there is variance in biomass regulations within Europe, because the Renewable Energy Directive is a minimum standard, and the countries can make it tighter, which has its own problems in any application, because even in an industry, if you have if you have a stricter regulation how to decarbonize in one country, well, then you're going to focus on a different country to decarbonize, but also to produce. So it creates an arbitrage there. It's just exacerbated to a really truly global issue when you actually talk about global fuels like sustainable aviation fuels.
Yeah.
Thanks, Thomas.
Maybe I can add to that, because indeed I agree. I mean, some certain level of harmonization at global level, but also within the EU would be really good. I mean, in the RED II, I mean, as you know, that's a directive. So we see it's quite differently implemented by the various 27 member states, which really leads to market distortions, as Lauren said, but also really leads to very different requirements we have. Even though we have stationary installations, we really need to adapt our strategy and our implementation and how we get the accreditation for our biomass in each of the member states. So the Commission has actually said that they would come forward with some guidelines on how to implement the sustainability criteria and also the greenhouse gas criteria as part of the RED II Article 29, I believe, which hasn't happened yet. And that is why also what Thomas mentioned, that a lot of the member states have not yet implemented these criteria actually, and are delayed, even though they have been transposed already, I think last year. So I think it would be really good to move to some level of harmonization and make sure that there is some certainty and that they also remain in force for the foreseeable future and are not being revised every 2 years.
If I can, Matthew, I would agree totally with what Winston just mentioned now. It was really essential for us, considering that we have now, we'll have a blending mandate, so obligation to blend a certain percentage of sustainable fuels at all airports, that we have a regulation on a directive. For a market or for an industry that is so integrated as the aviation sector, it's really essential for us that we don't have a discrepancy between the fuels you're going to find in Malmö versus the fuels you're going to find in Copenhagen. Because with different eligibility criteria, different SAF available, different prices, the temptation to choose different routes, different destination is very high. And that really there's a role there for regulators to also make sure that we can harmonize as much as possible across the continent.
Thanks, Laurent. We've lost your video, but don't worry.
Apologies.
We still hear you loud and clear. Gentlemen, we are coming towards the end of the time that we have, and I think now would be a good moment to hear from each of you, maybe your thoughts, having heard from each other today. Just final remarks, really, for our audience. If I could start with you, Laurent. I know you haven't heard the whole discussion, but based on the portion that you were lucky enough to join.
No, thanks, and apologies, my camera has refused to cooperate in the last minute. I think what's really essential for us is that we create trust in the system, aviation sector. You know, we know that from an aviation industry, and I think it's probably the same in other sector, that there is very big expectation for the sector to show and to align with the Paris Agreement. But it's really important that we create trust also from our end vis-a-vis the passengers, who are going to be asked to pay higher services or higher prices for their tickets. And that very closely ties in with what kind of criteria we want to set for ourselves when it comes to the stability of these fuels and the raw material and the feedstock. And there we have we're basically the discussions that we will see at the European level in the next months are going to be essentials. What, as a society, do we agree to be considered as eligible feedstock? What are the unintended consequences that we consider acceptable and those we consider as unacceptable? And this is very much an open discussion, and will remain so on one of these areas of the overall Fit for 55 package, which I see as being the most complex and possibly also the most important.
Thank you, Laurent. And Winston, yes, some final comments from you. You explained right at the beginning that 60% of your operation is there unavoidable emissions issues, but on the basis of the scenarios that you saw from Ricardo earlier and Thomas's interventions, I mean, do you feel that there is the opportunities are ripe, you know, for you to be able to employ bioenergy to achieve your targets, or are you concerned still, especially around these policy issues?
Yeah, thank you. No, absolutely. I mean, we, as I said, we have a roadmap which covers 2030 and the goal to become climate neutral in 2050. So we have all the different angles of our emission sources covered. Now it's really about implementing the technologies and scaling them. And it's really about also a speed and the time, right? I mean, we have our first targets, which are quite ambitious in 2030. It's 8 years to go from now. Some of these big projects we talked about, they have an lead time of 5 to 8 years, and that is mainly because of the permitting and the planning processes. So we need to have financial investment decisions within the next 1 or 2 years, also for our big alternative fuel and biomass projects. So it really it's a speed and also getting down to implementing, not just thinking about new targets. I think the discussion here was quite good, because you could see that within the different sectors we are quite aligned when it comes to the support for the Green Deal. I think we all have the goal to move away from fossil fuels as much and as fast as we can, both in terms of sustainability, but also for security of supply and import dependency, which has become very important in recent weeks. I think what was mentioned, which is also key for us, is for sure investment security, and have some form of harmonization when it comes to the different policies and how they are being implemented. And also what Laurent just said, to have a common understanding and having a trust in the system. I think that's absolutely very, very important. When it comes to the different policies, I think we all agree that the CO2 price, it can be a good driver, but we need to have also carbon leakage protection, and we need to have also the right compensation or funding schemes to de-risk some of these big projects going forward. On our biomass in particular, I mean, we are very much in support of having landfill bans for waste, as I mentioned, to streamline biomass certification, which is key.
On that landfill ban issue, there is an interesting question coming, which is a very good question from Dujen, based in China. She says that they are looking at the economic viability of waste-based biomass, but she picks up on your point about landfill bans. Are you aware of any regions where bans are in place?
Well, there's not when I talk about Europe, there's not a European landfill ban, but there are many landfill bans in different jurisdictions, depending sometimes on the different waste streams. So that is definitely the case. We actually are in favor of having one at the European level as well. But I think she was referring to in particular to for waste to energy, right?
That was the first point, yeah.
And there, of course, no, there's not.
Her question was whether around the economic viability of energy from waste-based biomass. What your thoughts were on that?
Well, it depends on the sources. We are dependent on the economic levers as well. As I said, if we used waste-based resources, of course, it can be economically very viable, because otherwise they are being landfilled. So they come at a rather low cost, while we are also reducing the need to landfill. If it's for primary or other sources of biomass, of course, the economics change quite significantly.
Thank you. Thomas, I'd like to come to you finally. I mean, it's one thing that's been very, very clear today is that whatever the opportunities are for bioenergy in general, within any one particular area, and obviously you have a very specific product portfolio, there's no lack of opportunity. So in actual fact, you know, this discussion today is about bioenergy in general, and I can see from the different speakers that it's not always about wood pellets. It's not always the right solution. On the other hand, I mean, the growth expectations 4 times, 5 times, I mean, vast numbers. Do you feel that you would diversify your portfolio, or is there enough opportunity already for you within this area?
Well, thank you, Matthew, for this question, and thank you for this great conversation also to the co-panelists. I will say that maximizing local biomass is absolutely key. Right, we supplement local biomass we create security and we create incremental supply, but local biomass and the global commodity that we represent, they don't compete, they go together. Right, we need to mobilize all forms of sustainable biomass that we have, because the opportunities are immense and almost unlimited. And ultimately, biomass is not going to be unlimited. From where we are today, it can be scaled dramatically, right? Like multiple times bigger than what we have today. And so there's fantastic opportunity in all these verticals that we've discussed today. I will say that what the examples that we have, and Laurent just said this very, very clearly, we don't have another choice, right? And so to focus on applications that don't really have another choice, like transatlantic flights with sustainable aviation fuels, or some of the hard to abate industries, like a blast furnace needs a carbon molecule, and it should be a bio-based carbon molecule, and maximize efficiencies. We had I think a question in the chat around the efficiency. A 30% efficient power plant, thankfully I'm not aware of too many of those. That's probably not the best usage of biomass in the long term, right? If you use biomass in energy, we should focus on combined heat and power installations where you have a 90% efficiency level. Ideally, you add bioenergy, carbon capture and storage to create negative emissions, right? To really create the best carbon benefit, the maximum carbon benefit. Like Winston said, with negative emissions in the cement industry, it's another great example of you create negative emissions. I will leave you with the following thought. The UN IPCC's four pathways to what we need to do to keep climate change at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, all require negative emissions. And bioenergy, carbon capture and storage in any of what we've talked about, and many of the applications is an alternative. And then of course the liquid side as an incremental big area. So I think those are, I would say those are my final thoughts. And Matthew, thanks for leading us through this fantastic conversation, and happy to answer further questions offline.
Yes, I thank you so much for all of you. On behalf of myself and our readers, it's just been fascinating, and really our first discussion looking in depth at the potential of bioenergy, and I can see it's going to be a conversation that we will come back to time and time again. Thank you very much to all of you for your input. So to our viewers, the readers that have stayed with us to the end, thank you very much for joining us. Our next debate, funnily enough, Winston, is on the EU ETS, which will be on the 31st of March. And so I'd look forward to welcoming you again there. A couple of thank yous, which are to my team here at Energy Post, Arison, who's been busy tweeting some of the key statements from today while we've been discussing it. Also to Ed in the background, making things run as smoothly as possible, which wasn't easy today with people coming and going on the panel. Thanks very much to you, Ed. And then just individually, Winston from Heidelberg Cement, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you very much. Great event.
And to Laurent for stepping up to the plate last minute. Thank you so much, and really fascinating to get the views from the airline industry in Europe. Laurent Doncel.
Thank you, Matthew. Pleasure.
And to our sponsor today, Enviva, and in the background, Jacob, thanks for your collaboration on organizing this event. But Thomas, to you for joining us today and sponsoring this fascinating discussion.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much to everybody, and I look forward to welcoming you all again soon on March 31st, when we'll be discussing the EU ETS. Thank you very much. And goodbye.
Thank you.